I'm Alara, 78 years old. My hands know the earth. For 50 years, my joy has been my garden. It wasn't just dirt, it was a sanctuary filled with rare, precious plants I raised from seed. It was proof that patience and quiet work always reward you. Hello, everyone, and this is the story of how I fought my own daughter and son-in-law by turning their greed into a natural disaster. Tell me quickly in the comments where you are watching from, and if you believe that nature is the strongest weapon, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the final harvest. My trouble began when my daughter Lena and her husband Mark came to me. They were struggling financially, and they convinced me to sell them my big, valuable family house cheaply. The deal was simple, based on family love. They would live in the main house, and I would keep the small carriage house attached to the property, plus my beautiful, historic garden. I signed the deed over, thinking I had secured my home and my legacy. The ink was barely dry on the paper before the lies began. 1 week later, Lena and Mark brought their truck over. Lena marched straight into my small carriage house. Her face was hard, completely different from the sad daughter who begged me for help. "Mom," she said, her voice cold and final, "the deal has changed. We need you to move out completely. The carriage house has to go on the market." I was stunned, but the real pain came next. Mark stood behind her, nodding. "And your garden, Alara," he added with a cruel laugh. "It's old and messy. We're going to pave over the whole thing and put in a modern patio. It's ugly now. You need to accept that those are just weeds." They tried to throw me out and destroy the 50 years of life I had poured into the earth. They thought they could win because they held the deed. But I forgot that while they owned the house, I still understood the language of the soil. I realized I couldn't fight the deed in court. I had to fight the land itself. My vast knowledge of botany, the exact pH, the precise nutrient balance, the invisible elements of the earth, was my final, ultimate weapon. This revenge would be subtle, scientific, and completely invisible. Lena's insult, calling my life's work weeds, was the final confirmation. My professional ethics meant nothing to them. They owned the deed, but I owned the knowledge of the earth. I knew I couldn't use harsh chemicals. That would be easily traceable by any lab. My revenge had to be slow-acting, scientific, and completely undetectable, making the disaster look like a tragic natural event, a curse on the soil. I treated my revenge like a highly complex scientific project. I retrieved my old, worn field journals, my lifelong record of soil conditions, rare plant needs, and botanical compounds. I started working in my old shed, mixing specific, potent, but harmless nutrients: phosphorus, zinc, iron, and nitrogen. This was my reverse growth formula. The purpose was to drastically overfeed the new plants Lena was about to purchase, causing them to grow quickly and brilliantly, but exhaust their energy, leading to a spectacular, confusing collapse weeks later. I didn't care about the money anymore. I cared about the garden's soul. This revenge was for the garden, for the land they desecrated. My first task was the initial sabotage. Lena and Mark were bringing in their first batch of expensive, imported, new landscaping tomorrow. I worked under the darkness of night, spreading the first stage of my formula, a potent mix of nitrogen and phosphorus across the entire garden bed. My hands, though old, worked with practiced ease. The soil looked exactly the same. No one would ever know. I sealed my shed and went inside. I knew the initial result would be beautiful, but the beauty would be a lie. Lena and Mark arrived the next morning triumphant, bringing huge, expensive trucks filled with trendy, exotic new landscaping, the type of plants that demanded perfect care. Mark wore a smug look, watching as I sat quietly in the carriage house window. They immediately hired a landscaping crew to install the plants. I watched silently, knowing the fate of every plant was sealed the moment it touched the poisoned ground. They paid a fortune for new soil and fertilizer, completely unaware that the initial sabotage was already in place, waiting to react with the new nutrients. The initial effect was immediate and psychological. The plants looked amazing. In the first 3 weeks, the garden thrived. The leaves were a deeper, more brilliant green than normal. The blooms were huge and vibrant. Lena was ecstatic. She gloated to her friends, showing off the garden and claiming, "We fixed Mom's ugly weeds. We are much better gardeners." She took credit for the intense, accelerated growth my formula caused. This was exactly what I needed. The extreme, unnatural perfection was the first part of the trap. It convinced Lena and Mark that they were naturally gifted gardeners and that the initial subtle problems couldn't possibly be their fault. They were proud, smug, and completely oblivious to the fact that they were watching the last frantic burst of growth before the inevitable, total biological collapse. The psychological high lasted exactly 4 weeks, the time it took for the plants to burn through the initial dose of nitrogen. Then the crash began. I watched from my window. One morning, I noticed a single rose bush near the fence. Its leaves were curled inward, and the edges were turning a strange, sickly yellow. By the next day, the yellowing had spread to the neighboring hydrangeas. Within 72 hours, the entire flower bed was showing visible, confusing symptoms. Leaves curling, flowers wilting prematurely, and the sturdy stems bending as if they were made of paper. The beautiful, vibrant color was rapidly draining away. Lena and Mark panicked. They immediately called expensive landscape experts. I watched silently as the experts knelt by the plants, digging samples, looking completely baffled. They took soil samples and tested the water. I knew their results would be confusing. The pH levels would be drastically unstable, too high or too low, reacting to the buried agents. They would only see the symptoms of an impossible blight. Lena started screaming at the experts, blaming the store, the soil company, and the delivery truck. She blamed everything except the transfer of ownership. Retention hook, the scientific mystery is at its peak. I knew the experts would leave with only one conclusion. The soil was spontaneously unstable. This was the moment I realized the revenge was working perfectly.
The baffled reports from the experts sent Lena into paranoia. She tried aggressive chemical fixes, expensive fertilizers, and broad-spectrum pesticides that would normally solve any garden problem. I knew this would only accelerate the death because the soil was already overloaded and chemically damaged by my initial compound. I started adding subtle public pressure. I would take short walks, always pausing near Lena's property line when neighbors were outside. I would say, loud enough for them to hear, "It's such a tragedy. That looks exactly like Dutch elm disease," referencing a non-existent, terrifying local blight. Or, "I hear the soil tests came back highly contaminated." The gossip spread immediately. The neighbors became convinced the house was cursed. Lena became convinced the garden was exacting revenge because they had made me leave. She stopped blaming the soil and started blaming the house's history. This was the psychological pivot. The physical decay was now fueling her personal guilt. She was paranoid, watching the garden every hour while I sat calmly in my carriage house. The first batch of expensive imported plants died spectacularly. Lena and Mark were forced to pay a massive amount to have the entire garden ripped out and replaced. They bought an entirely new batch of plants, desperate to restore the appearance of success. I anticipated this second attempt. I waited until the new plants were installed in the fresh soil. And then, under the cover of night, I performed my second, more potent and more targeted sabotage. I introduced a compound specifically designed to block the absorption of essential micronutrients like zinc and iron. The new plants would look healthy for a few days, drawing Lena into a false sense of security, and then they would suffer a slow, agonizing death from malnutrition right in the middle of fresh, expensive soil. The second batch failed faster than the first. The new landscape experts were even more baffled. They tested the new soil and had no answers. Finally, one expert told Lena, "The soil is fundamentally unstable and toxic to growth. We advise selling the house. You cannot sustain a garden here." The experts had given up, effectively cursing the land in professional terms. The experts' final judgment, that the land was fundamentally unstable, was the fatal blow. Lena and Mark realized the problem was the house itself, not their gardening skills. The garden had become a massive, embarrassing symbol of failure and financial hemorrhaging. The neighbors were openly gossiping about the cursed property and the impossible blight. The house, which they had hoped to flip for a massive profit, was now tainted. Its value plummeted because no buyer would want a beautiful house attached to a dead, toxic-looking garden. The psychological warfare peaked when Mark began to turn his fury on Lena. I heard the arguments echoing through the walls. Mark screamed, realizing that Lena's initial demand to get rid of me and pave the garden over had caused this entire financial nightmare. The eternal collapse is imminent. The betrayal had completely poisoned their relationship. They realized the garden was the least of their problems. Their own marriage was dying in the same soil. The fighting intensified. Mark, desperate and facing ruin, finally came to me. He didn't come to yell. He came in shame and desperation. He found me sitting calmly in my carriage house, trimming my small, healthy indoor plants. He didn't ask about the sale. He just stared at my thriving indoor greenery and then looked outside at his dead lawn. "Elara," he asked, his voice shaking, "what did you do to the soil? Just tell me the truth, please." I denied nothing. I looked him straight in the eye and answered only with botanical facts. The soil's pH level was always delicate, Mark. You replaced the original nitrogen balance with cheap, fast material. You disturbed the cycle. Nature always corrects itself. Mark was left with the truth he couldn't fight. He knew I had done something, but he could never prove it was intentional, and he certainly couldn't fight nature in court. He realized that the woman he dismissed as old and noisy was the one person who truly understood the house's ecosystem. He walked away defeated, knowing the truth was scientifically untraceable. Lena and Mark had hit rock bottom. They could not live in the house. The shame and the fighting were too much, and they could not sell the house on the open market because of the impossible blight and the terrible aesthetics. They were financially trapped. They finally found a cheap developer who specialized in property teardowns. Lena and Mark sold the property at a massive, humiliating loss, less than half of what they originally paid me. They lived in silence, their entire financial ambition shattered by a failing garden. I had planned for this moment. I used the remaining savings from my original sale, along with some quiet community support, to buy back my carriage house and a small portion of the land, the area surrounding my prized garden plot, from the teardown developer. I secured my home and my legacy. My revenge was complete because my home was safe and their greed was punished. 1 year later, the chaos was gone. Lena and Mark were dealing with their ruin far away. I was back in my carriage house, looking out at the earth that had fought so hard for me. The plot where Lena's plants died was not just fallow ground. I began the long, patient work of restoring the soil, testing the pH levels and neutralizing the remaining compounds. This was my final act of healing. I finally reached the point where the soil was clean. I went to the spot where Elena's prized rose died, and I planted a new seed, a simple, strong perennial. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the earth in my hands. The greatest victory wasn't destroying them. It was securing my simple, peaceful life. I looked at the house and realized my truth. They thought they stole a home, but they only stole the land. They never understood the magic in the earth. The next morning, I stepped outside. The flower had bloomed, a perfect, vibrant color, in the exact spot where Lena's prize rose withered away. My quiet knowledge saved my home, my garden, and my soul. The earth had finally returned my favor, never too old to understand the science of nature.